Hello, and welcome to the deep dive from Westferry Times. You know, the relationship between the UK and the EU, it feels like something we talk about constantly, yet it's still, well, pretty complicated, isn't it?
It absolutely is. Even now, almost a decade after the referendum vote and, several years into the trade and cooperation agreement, it's still shifting.
Exactly. So today we're going to try and get a clearer picture. We want to understand where things actually stand right now and maybe, just maybe, where they're heading.
hmm
And we've been digging into some really insightful material for this, excerpts from Westferry Times, The Future of UK-EU Relations. Think of this as our guide. Helping us unpack all of this is Dr. Marcus Bennett. He's a political scientist, lectures on European affairs, international diplomacy, and knows the ins and outs of post-Brexit Britain. Welcome. It's great to have you.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
So let's jump right in. After all this time, what's the baseline? Where are UK-EU relations sitting today?
Well, that word you used, complicated, I think
Mhm.
the Westferry Times reporting would definitely agree. It's probably the best single word. You've got the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, the TCA, which, yes, it gives us care of free trade.
Which was the goal, right?
It was a major goal, yes, but it also brought in a lot of new checks, a lot of paperwork, hurdles that weren't there before. Diplomatically, things have perhaps warmed up a tiny bit, especially since the Windsor Framework in 2023, that deal trying to sort out the Northern Ireland issues.
Okay.
But, and this is key, the underlying structural tensions, they haven't gone away. They're still sort of simmering beneath the surface.
So less outright chaos than maybe immediately after Brexit, but
Okay.
not exactly smooth sailing either.
Precisely. The Westferry Times piece talks about moving from chaos to conditional calm. I think that captures it quite well. You still see these points of, let's call it low-level friction. Things like fisheries access, rules for financial services, migration policies, and Northern Ireland, that's always there.
Right.
But what's interesting, and the reporting picks up on this, is this sense on both sides, this growing recognition that they have to work together pragmatically. It's becoming less about the big ideology and more about, well, just making things work day to day.
That makes a lot of sense. Practical needs often take over eventually. Now, one of the big promises of Brexit was taking back control, regulatory sovereignty. How's that actually played out economically based on what the Westferry Times found?
It's fascinating, actually. The Westferry Times suggests that actual divergence, the UK is setting vastly different rules from the EU, has been pretty minimal so far.
Really? Why is that?
Well, it seems it's not so much about a lack of desire, perhaps, but more about practical business realities. Businesses, especially those trading with the EU, are apparently quite worried about having to deal with two different sets of rules.
Yeah.
Think dual standards and costly adjustments. That's the phrase the report uses. It's expensive and complex.
Ah, okay.
So the UK government is doing this constant balancing act,
Yeah.
wanting regulatory freedom on one hand, but needing access to the EU market, which is still by far its biggest trading partner, on the other.
It's that classic tension, isn't it? Freedom versus economic reality. Does the report mention any specific areas?
Yeah, mention some modest changes,
Huh?
things like data protection, some tweaks in financial regulation.
Yeah.
But the overall picture, the Westferry Times suggests the UK regulatory environment is still closely aligned with the EU's.
And that's largely out of necessity.
Largely out of necessity, exactly. There was an example highlighted where divergence on data privacy was considered to align maybe with another country, but the potential disruption for UK-EU business meant it didn't happen.
Got it. And the impact on actual trade numbers, how is that shaken out?
Well, the reports indicate there's been a slight recovery in trade since the initial Brexit shock. But it hasn't bounced back to where it was before Brexit. And what really comes through is the uneven impact. Small and medium-sized businesses, SMEs, seem to be struggling disproportionately. They're the ones really feeling the pinch from the customs bureaucracy and supply chain delays.
While bigger companies maybe have the resources to cope better.
Exactly. Larger firms have found ways to adapt, it seems. But the message from the Westferry Times is clear. Those friction costs are real and ongoing. They haven't just disappeared.
Right, those extra hurdles add up, especially if you're a smaller operation. Let's shift focus a bit to Northern Ireland. The Windsor Framework that was presented as a major step forward. How does the Westferry Times assess its impact?
It was definitely seen as a diplomatic breakthrough in UK-EU terms, according to the report. It brought in the Green Lane idea for goods staying within Northern Ireland, which cut down checks coming from GB significantly.
Okay, so smoother internal UK trade.
Yes, and it also gave the Northern Ireland Assembly, Stormont, a mechanism, the Stormont Break, to have some say on significant new EU laws applying there. Crucially, for the wider relationship, it did seem to signal a moment where, trust began to rebuild a bit between London and Brussels.
But did it solve the political problems within Northern Ireland?
Ah, that's the key question, isn't it? And the Westferry Times is clear. While it helped UK-EU relations, the framework itself is still politically divisive in Northern Ireland. Unionist parties in particular still argue it effectively creates a border down the Irish Sea, separating Northern Ireland from the rest of the UK.
So it's working on one level, but maybe not on another?
Pretty much. The report suggests, so far, yes, it's holding, technically, but it's also described as fragile. A lot depends on the political dynamics there, especially the DUP's long-term position.
Definitely sounds like one to keep watching closely. Okay, let's broaden out again. Beyond trade in Northern Ireland, what about areas like security, defense, foreign policy? How has Brexit affected cooperation there?
Well, this is where the Westferry Times points out a real irony.
Oh.
Despite the UK formally leaving the EU structures, big geopolitical events like Russia's invasion of Ukraine have actually pushed the UK and EU member states into closer practical cooperation.
So real-world crises are overriding the formal separation.
It seems so. The UK is still a major European power, obviously a key player in NATO, very active in intelligence sharing. So when it comes to things like coordinating sanctions against Russia, sending military aid to Ukraine, tackling cyber threats, there's been a lot of informal collaboration.
Does the report suggest this might become more formalized?
It raises the possibility, yes.
Yeah.
It mentions potential for more structured agreements down the line, maybe specifically on things like cybersecurity or even energy security, where working together just makes sense for both sides.
Interesting. Now, what about the people-to-people stuff? Migration, travel, student exchanges, those connections that often feel very direct. What does the Westferry Times say about that?
Yeah, the report suggests this area has seen some real damage. Well, the obvious example is the UK leaving the Erasmus student exchange program. Has made it much harder and more expensive for UK students to study abroad in Europe and vice versa.
Right.
And ending free movement means EU citizens can't just come and live and work in the UK easily anymore, and UK citizens face similar hurdles in the EU. The Westferry Times mentioned specific groups feeling this, like musicians, academics, and seasonal workers facing new barriers.
Is the Turing scheme the UK's replacement for Erasmus, filling that gap?
The report suggests not really, or at least not yet. It apparently hasn't matched Erasmus in terms of the sheer numbers or the ease of participation.
Are there any talks happening to try and ease some of these restrictions for travel or work?
According to the Westferry Times, there have been some diplomatic discussions, yes, but crucially, no breakthroughs yet.
Why not?
Well, it seems these issues are quite politically sensitive in Westminster. But the report also notes there's growing pressure, economic and cultural pressure, to maybe look at these rules again, because the current situation is causing problems for certain sectors.
It really highlights how policy impacts everyday lives, doesn't it? Okay, what about the mood inside the UK itself? What does the Westferry Times tell us about what the public and the politicians actually want from the relationship now?
It's a nuanced picture. The polling data mentioned in the report apparently shows growing regret about Brexit. More people thinking it was maybe the wrong decision.
But does that mean people want to rejoin the EU?
Not necessarily, no. The report is careful to point that out. There isn't a clear majority pushing for re-entry. What there does seem to be, according to the Westferry Times, is a wider appetite for a closer relationship, especially among, say, younger people and also business groups who are dealing with the practicalities day to day.
And how are the main political parties positioning themselves on this?
Well, the Westferry Times analysis suggests Labour, for instance, talks about wanting a better trade deal, closer cooperation in specific sectors. But they've been very clear, no return to the EU itself or the single market or customs union. The Conservatives, meanwhile, tend to take a more cautious line, still really emphasizing the sovereignty aspect gained from leaving.
So the overall political direction isn't about going back.
No, the report frames it as a period of post-Brexit recalibration, rather than any kind of move toward rejoining. It uses the term pragmatic rapprochement, trying to find ways to work more closely, but definitely from the outside.
Pragmatic rapprochement. That sums it up well. Okay, last question then. Looking further ahead, say the next 5 or 10 years, what's the potential trajectory according to the Westferry Times? What might the future hold?
The overall prediction seems to be one of incremental reconnection, slow step-by-step rebuilding. We'll likely see more of these sectoral deals being explored maybe on things like youth mobility schemes, cooperation on science funding like Horizon Europe, perhaps finding smoother arrangements for financial services, areas where there's a clear mutual interest and maybe less political baggage.
But still outside the EU.
Definitely. The report reiterates that rejoining the EU looks very unlikely in the foreseeable future. What's expected instead is the development of a more functional partnership. Okay. And the driver for this, according to the Westferry Times, won't really be about ideology or wanting to be European again, but more about sheer necessity, finding ways to manage shared challenges together.
So learning to live side by side again.
Exactly. The report concludes it's about rebuilding trust and learning to live next door again, amicably.
A pragmatic, perhaps slightly hopeful note to end on. Dr. Marcus Bennett, thank you so much. That was incredibly helpful in navigating the insights from the Westferry Times. Really appreciate your time today. Thank you for watching Westferry Times.
You're very welcome. My pleasure.
And a big thank you to you, our listeners, for joining this deep dive.